ethical algorithms. I want to start with where many people think the problem is, where it will go if we don't solve things, which is that killer robots will be developed and they will kill us all because they're killer robots. So to solve that, we need to have ethical algorithms. But that's kind of the really extreme problem. More prosaically, but no less importantly, there's problems such as bias, and there's a really famous problem with a professor, an academic in the United States, an African-American woman who found that facial recognition couldn't recognize her without a white mask on. And this problem also manifests itself in health, which is the area that I work in, and you find that there are algorithms that allocate resources that says, well, this person should have this type of health care, this person should have another type of health care. And again, we find that those algorithms can be biased against African Americans, against other types of people. A lot of people think this is about the data, and this is all based on just really biased data. And some of that's true. We've all had the experience of typing in CEO to a search engine and there being pictures of men, basically. But that data reflects society. It reflects our human biases. And I would go beyond that and say, actually, it's the developers that we really need to look to here. It's the software engineers, because it's their biases and their prejudices that are built into algorithms. That health example earlier, they'd chosen data that reflected very historic biases and lack of healthcare for African Americans. So the solution to all of this that people think about is, well, let's build ethical algorithms. Let's build trust and ethics into this technology. But what do we really mean by trust and ethics? Now, with apologies to Christian, I'm going to just try and explain briefly some different ethical approaches. So a really common one is utilitarianism, which is the greatest good for the least cost. Now, but this can have the consequences of it doesn't really care about the individual. So the founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, also invented the panopticon here, which is where one person could see hundreds of people in one place. Greatest good, least cost. Another approach is more rules-based. Immanuel Kant's very much associated with this. And this says things like don't lie. You just shouldn't lie, no matter what the consequences are. So even if 100 people will die if you lie, you shouldn't lie. A different take on this is actually kind of going really to the human, and there's a sort of Aristotelian, Platonic virtue ethics, which says that, okay, so good things are done by good people. Well, how do you know he's a good person or she's a good person? Well, they do good things, don't they? And so for me, it all becomes a bit circular. Now, you're probably getting a bit frustrated now and thinking, well, this is all a bit complicated. But it's worse than that, because we actually have to consider not just Western philosophy as well. We have to consider Confucianism or Ubuntu. There's lots of other philosophical traditions that you need to take into account when thinking about ethical algorithms. But in terms of what we should do, you should at least think about these different schools, and every organization needs to come up with their own set of principles. There's lots of lists out there, whether it's the European Union or IEEE or whoever, but any organization that's using data needs to think about what's important to them and have their own set of principles. But that's where a lot of organizations stop. And what you really need to do is then say, okay, well, let's build it into our technology. Can we build artificial intelligence that actually preserves privacy, that doesn't need to see your personal data? Can we build artificial intelligence that actually can explain itself? Don't just accept that the best AI is a black box and we can't do anything about it. That's a challenge that lots of people are facing up to. And there's also design challenge as well, thinking about how we actually explain the use of data. Can we use nice little visuals like we used here in Alpha to say, here's the data we're using to understand your sleep, or break down the consent process into its constituent parts, and to do these things to really build trust in the user. But we also need to look to accountability. And one thing we do is we have an external company called Ética, also based here in Barcelona, that actually marks us on our ethical strategies. So it's not just us marking ourselves. The final thing I would say in terms of the solution that you need to look to is publish. Building ethical algorithms and ethical AI is hard. A lot of people don't really yet know how to do this. So I encourage everyone to publish and learn from others. And in doing that, you need to publish your the challenges and the things you learn. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of what have we learned. One of the big ones is, well, there are trade-offs in ethics. A big one we found in the audit that Ética did was one of our products we wanted to understand whether it was biased, and they said, actually, we can't, because you haven't collected any data that would allow us to understand, because you focus so much on privacy. A further challenge is this idea of, well, should we let the perfect be the enemy of the good? Should we say, well, actually, the Trabant is good enough to get us to an ethical place? Or should we wait until we've got the Rolls-Royce ethical algorithm? We think that probably we should go for the Trabant and then grow from there. But a related challenge to this is you have to do a little bit of this all at once. So if you have 5 ethical principles, you can't say, we're just going to do 3 of them and leave the other 2 for a bit. It's a bit like a house of cards. If you take one of those principles away that you've carefully thought through, the whole thing will fall down. And you also have to really attend to the context. So that biased audit we talked about earlier, we found that was kind of okay that we didn't understand it that well, because the harm that could result wasn't that great because it was focused on well-being. Whereas if we'd actually focused, if this was an algorithm that was focused on treatment and denying some people treatment, that would have been bad. And then finally, I'd encourage people to admit their mistakes. And I have to say that I made a mistake here today, because normally I say I won't appear on panels where there's not 50-50 men and women, but I didn't look at the panel quickly enough. So I know that Patricia did a great job of trying to get 50-50, but couldn't get there in the end. But I didn't spot it, and it was too late for me to pull out. So I just wanted to sort of admit that mistake here today. And I hope that that's given you a nice little snapshot of how to build ethical algorithms and avoid those killer robots.
Great talk. I really enjoy it. Question for Oliver. Do you believe in the possibility of a universal ethic for AI? Really insightful presentation. By the way, a good point about the 50-50 panel. Okay. So universal ethic for AI.
I don't believe there is. I don't think that after sort of thousands of years of talking about ethics across lots of different societies, we will suddenly solve that problem just because we have a new technology that's come along. Right? So I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's worth people thinking about that and understanding it. One of the aspects I see is when people are applying different ethical principles across different countries, often the principles are quite common. So they will be thinking about bias, they'll be thinking about privacy, they'll be thinking about explainability, for instance. I mean, it's the trade-offs they make that will be different between different societies. You can kind of see this with COVID-19, where Taiwan has done quite a good job of using technology to help in its efforts. But it has a balance of individual versus the group, which is quite different from perhaps where Spain might be, for instance. Now we can debate about whether Spain could get there or not, but it's certainly that's a trade-off they made that's differently. I'd actually love to hear what Christian would say on this, since he is actually a proper philosopher, whereas I'm a pretend philosopher.